the concern we've had over the past, I guess, few months, we've had lots of Mississippians concerned about the windmills that we have in the north part of the state. And also have had concerns about the wildlife, the migratory birds, and if it's any kind of effect it's having. So I appreciate our speakers coming today. Just going to get started. We're going to try to limit each speaker to maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions if there are any. Our first one's Ed Penny with Ducks Unlimited. All right, I didn't see you. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Chairman Suber and Chairman Carter, members of the committee. My name is Ed Penny, and I'm the Director of Public Policy for Ducks Unlimited here in the Southern region. I'm also a waterfowl ecologist. So thanks for the invitation to speak. I want to make a few comments and obviously open for questions too. So most of y'all know Ducks Unlimited. We've got more than 1 million members and supporters in the U.S. and about 9,500 here in the state. Many of whom are sportsmen and women. So we represent a significant voice in the conservation community. We've been in the U.S. doing wetland conservation for about 85 years now. Our mission is to conserve, restore, and manage wetlands and habitats for waterfowl and people. And we work in every state and Canada and Mexico. We've conserved about 360,000 acres of habitat here in the state, and much of that work is on our public lands and private lands, including much work with our friends in the rice industry and rice farmers. So we appreciate your continued support for the Mississippi Outdoor Stewardship Trust Fund, which supports habitat investments across the state, as well as migratory birds and work on our public lands. So I also want to note that our regional office is here in Ridgeland, where we have engineers, biologists, project managers working on projects around the South. And our efforts, my efforts now, are grounded in science and support for our mission. So we encourage you to take a science-based and inclusive approach to wind energy development here in the state. It's important to involve stakeholders like agriculture and other industries like hunting. The ag industry is valued at about $10 billion, and hunting, fishing, and wildlife watching contributes an estimated $2.75 billion to the state every year and an estimated 60,000 jobs. Waterfowl hunting in particular is about $150 million in 2010. So those are old numbers, and we need to take a better look at that to get more modern figures. So first of all, a couple recommendations here. We want to acknowledge that these agreements to develop wind energy on private lands are legal, they're regulated, and they're voluntary between the landowner and the wind developer. These decisions are based on strongly held principles on private property rights. And just like doing a wetland project on private land, that's a voluntary decision that a landowner makes. But it's wise to consider migratory birds and their habitats and strive to avoid, minimize, and offset any impacts. And there's some scientific evidence of impacts, but to be clear, and I want to make this very clear, more research is needed for the lower Mississippi Valley, including Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi. So I want to highlight a few potential impacts, but again, more information is needed. So, and this is common sense, there's construction-based impacts, dust, noise, habitat fragmentation, disturbance during construction, so birds are going to avoid places like that. Then there's post-construction impacts. And direct impacts for waterfowl mostly fall under death, but the limited published scientific data suggests that this is not significant for waterfowl. But there's frequency, there's differences connected to this, and that's related to visibility, weather conditions, tower design, site-specific factors, and we can go into those here in a little bit. It also hinges on bird behavior. So there's a few things, several things that we need to figure out before we decide the true impacts to waterfowl and migratory birds. You know, there's things like wind farm features, facility features that can minimize risk, but to me, the most important thing to discuss here is post-construction and the indirect impacts of wind facilities. So displacement is the most common impact for both onshore and offshore wind development for waterfowl. And in fact, there's published data that talks about breeding pairs of waterfowl in the Dakotas and the Prairie Pothole region, which is the most important place for breeding waterfowl on the continent. there is evidence of reduced breeding bird densities in areas with wind facilities. So that's the biggie right there. And then I've got some other data that I want to present to you about coastal Texas. There's some published research, and I can share that with y'all. There's some published research in coastal Texas, pre and post wind facility construction that highlights how there's been a 70% decline in redhead abundance. Redheads are diving duck species that nest in the prairies. They winter primarily in the Laguna Madre of Texas. So there has been an observed 70% decline in abundance of that species. So I'm going to wrap this up here. To minimize risk of to birds, we recommend using the latest science. We can make claims, we can see things in the field when we're hunting or driving around looking for ducks, but we need to make sure that we have the latest science, the best science, in order to make the most informed decisions. So I propose that we do need a large-scale study to look at potential impacts. There are ways to do that. I'm proud to be a Mississippi State graduate, so they've got a waterfowl department there that does great work with our friends at MDWFP. Ducks Unlimited works quite a bit with them as well. So we need more science to look at potential impacts in this area, but there's also an issue of offsetting unavoidable impacts, and we can do that through more investment in habitat conservation. I recommend that we use existing mechanisms to do that. There's always partnerships to be had on public lands, private lands, and we want to make sure that we're doing it in the right places. So avoiding first, minimizing, and then offsetting any potential impacts is important. I'd love to hear what our partners in MDWFP have to say. They do have great survey data on waterfowl abundance, and we can use a lot of different tools to get the answers to this. But we need more science. We need to minimize, avoid, and offset risk, and we can do that through more habitat conservation. Those are my recommendations on behalf of DU. I would welcome any questions.
Does anyone have any questions? All right, Senator Frazier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your concerns about habitat being affected by the windmills. Do you all have a position on solar panel farms? They're popping up all over the place, and they're in Mississippi now. Do y'all have any position on how we can monitor solar panel farms and impact it's going to have on wildlife?
That's also a good question, and any alternative energy does require some deliberation, some transparency, some stakeholder involvement. There is also similar situations in Texas with solar development. Again, avoiding and minimizing and offsetting those potential impacts is important. And in order to avoid these impacts, there is very well accessible information on conservation lands. That's wildlife management areas, national wildlife refuges, conservation easements, waterfowl-friendly agriculture like rice, which supports a lot of waterfowl. So, I would recommend that we do the same thing, that we assess impacts and we try to do those three things.
Thank you.
Senator Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned in Texas about the 70% decline in that specific species. Was that related to construction or was it ongoing operation of the windmills? Do you know?
So that was ongoing operation. So they looked at it pre-construction, they looked at waterfowl abundance pre-construction and then post-construction.
Also, we've been talking, there's a bill active in the Energy Committee right now talking about a study committee on wind turbines. Part of that bill establishes a moratorium. Do you believe that that's necessary for us to continue to study what's going on with the wind?
That's a good question, and I'm going to avoid the answer of saying I support a moratorium, but in order to be deliberate and in order to do real science, that does take time. I'll leave it to y'all to figure out how long that takes.
All right, Senator Bryan, question.
I looked at the Ducks Unlimited website, and it seemed to me the major concern I saw on the website was the concern about habitat in Canada due to the increased fracking around the oil sites. Is that a major impact on the duck population?
I think the biggest threat to waterfowl populations is loss of breeding habitat. That's coming from land use conversion and permanent drainage of wetlands. We've been in significant drought in a lot of parts of the prairies over the last 4 or 5 years, and that's a lot of what we're experiencing here, reduced waterfowl populations as a result of it's starting to be long-term drought. So that's the biggest issue.
All right, anyone else have any questions? Senator Seymour?
Ed, on the data that y'all have collected, have y'all reached out to like the Army Corps of Engineers? I know they do studies on top of studies, especially on the South Louisiana and Mississippi tributaries into the Gulf. There should be a lot of data already out there, research that we could pull from. Have y'all collected any from them?
We have not, but I want to say that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has data. The Army Corps of Engineers looks at a lot of hydrology and water-related impacts and projects, but the Fish and Wildlife Service has a very important role to play here. They've got a lot of mapping that's already been done, particularly for Arkansas, where this is also an issue. I would encourage Fish and Wildlife Service to do the same for Mississippi, work with MDWFP, work with partners like Ducks Unlimited in the ag industry. I know they're speaking later, but it's important to get everybody at the table and talk about what the real impacts are.
All right, I sure appreciate it.
Thank you.
You speaking. Next, is Stu Webster here? I wasn't sure if he made it. All right, Mr. Webster. We appreciate you coming to Mississippi.
I appreciate being here. Thank you very much. Chairman Carter, Chairman Suber, and distinguished members of the Senate Energy and Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks Committees. Thanks again for the opportunity to provide testimony on wind energy development in Mississippi. I'm going to read off my comments and I'm happy to take questions. My name's Stu Webster. I'm the Senior Director of Permitting and Environmental Policy for Triple Oak Power, US-based wind energy company. With projects in about 22 states, various stages of development, Mississippi included. Over my 17-year career in wind, I have expertise in areas of energy development and operations, most notably airspace and wildlife compatibility questions. I've worked for 2 other development companies, oversaw wildlife compliance of a 5,000 megawatt fleet of wind energy assets across the US, led a mitigation evaluation program for the Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute, which Ducks Unlimited is a board member of, a combination of nonprofit, state agency, and industry representatives that was evaluating for reducing impacts to wildlife. I'm also the principal subject matter expert for the American Clean Powers Wildlife State and Federal Permitting Committees. Held leadership positions in various industry groups related to airspace and wildlife, collaborated extensively with industry counterparts, academia, federal agencies such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the FAA, Department of Defense, and the Weather Service, as well as state wildlife agencies. I have participated in numerous technical and regulatory processes aimed at elevating research and understanding of wind energy siting topics, many of which my colleague from Ducks Unlimited mentioned moments ago. And worked with federal and state lawmakers to find common ground ways of addressing these questions. Before I talk about wildlife impact mitigation and airspace, I just want to acknowledge that wind energy is a new economic opportunity in Mississippi. And like any new venture, there are understandably questions about how this new venture fits with existing regional conditions. The conversation happening here is not unusual over the decades of wind energy deployment throughout the US. And as many decades of experience and research has been gained about wildlife and airspace impacts. Understandably, new technologies generate questions, and I'm going to try and answer some of those questions for you today. About 15 years ago, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service convened a 4-year public dialogue with researchers, regulators, wind industry, academics, and conservation representatives, developing what ultimately became in 2012 the Wind Energy Guidelines, or what is colloquially called the WEGs. a widely followed set of voluntary guidelines that provide a structured scientific process for addressing wildlife conservation concerns at all stages of development, including operations. Industry is strongly incentivized to adhere to these guidelines, and they have proven very practical and effective for conserving species and reducing stakeholder conflict. A foundational element throughout the WEGs is a framework for industry and wildlife agencies, such as Mississippi's Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks, to communicate early and often with each other, exchange data and information so that informed siting decisions can be made. In fact, my being here with you this morning was coincidentally made possible due to a meeting and a site visit yesterday with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Arkansas Game and Fish Commission representatives about one of our projects in their jurisdiction, specifically on the topic of waterfowl. In addition to the WEGs, the wind industry and wildlife advocates have also had decades of experience building substantive understanding of wind-wildlife interactions, data, and peer-reviewed studies, many of which are publicly available. The research is largely at scale with the growth of the industry, and we know enough today to realize and implement solutions that reduce and avoid wildlife impacts. Importantly, game species populations such as waterfowl have been monitored and studied for over 100 years in North America. The amount of data collected and analyzed about waterfowl and other game species is unprecedented in wildlife science. So combining these two spatially and temporally extensive sources of data and analysis, wind and wildlife studies and waterfowl management research, the weight of evidence indicates negligible effects on waterfowl by wind energy, either directly by collision or indirectly by avoidance or displacement behavior. In the last 20 years of wind, wildlife, and game species management data collection, all indications are that wind energy and waterfowl are largely compatible with one another despite measurable effects. If they were not, there would be a very different national dialogue about this topic, given the economic and societal importance of game species. I reemphasize here that wind energy is new to the Mississippi Delta region, and therefore some of those questions I alluded to being asked about this new venture here in the region is understandably going to be related to wildlife. For projects following the WEG stepwise approach to evaluating a site, there are expectations for developers and wildlife agencies to work together to design studies specific to help resolve regional specific questions. As you will hear on commercial and military airspace next, this early and often stakeholder communication is a key solution to many questions about wind energy. Per federal regulations, any structure taller than 200 feet must be evaluated by the FAA to ensure it's safe for civilian and military aviation operations. Wind turbines, no exception, and airspace standards are one of many federal laws, rules, and policies that have regulated and guided the deployment of approximately 75,000 wind turbines now operating throughout the United States and its territories. Currently, a significant number of those 75,000 turbines are operating in agricultural heartlands of the United States from coast to coast and border to border, with many of these regions supported by pilots safely applying fertilizer, pesticides, and fungicides. We have been working with landowner partners in the Mississippi Delta for going on 4 years now, and we understand agricultural operations in this region are different than, say, the Midwest. For example, we understand Delta region pilots conduct more flights on average than in other areas of the US, and the nature of flooded ag landscapes means ag pilots are the most effective and efficient means of conducting crop maintenance. Regardless of these differences, safety remains a top priority for Triple O Power and our industry. So by coordinating early and often with our landowner partners and their aerial service providers, we ensure agricultural fields that we develop in can be safely maintained while hosting wind turbines, as the last 20 years of wind energy operations has proven. As an example, Triple O Power developed a wind project in South Texas in a county with mixed agriculture that includes flooded rice fields that are heavily reliant on aerial operations. We acquired this project that had stalled due in part to concerns from local agricultural pilots. We listened to those concerns. We made siting and operational adjustments that led to a mutually agreeable outcome for both the project and local aerial operations. The same project has been in operation since 2023, and we're proud that the concerns based on uncertainty and a lack of communication before we came along were alleviated by our willingness to listen and collaborate with our landowners and their aerial service providers. Here again, early and often communication led to compatibility where non-compatibility was erroneously assumed. Met towers, which are less than 200 feet typically, are used by the industry to ascertain baseline data about the economic viability of a site. Most towers being less than 200 feet are thus not subject to FAA reporting requirements. Despite the lack of regulatory requirement, we understand that any tall structure within an agricultural setting represents safety concern for ag pilots. To address this concern, companies like Triple O Power submit our Met Tower locations regardless of the lack of requirement to the FAA. We also submit to the Mississippi Agricultural Aviation Association those Met Tower locations pursuant to a House bill that this body passed some time back. I'm proud of the efforts the industry has made to be good stewards of the community that we work in. 75,000 operating wind turbines of all types of environments and landscapes have indicated compatibility by and large, with some exceptions here and there that oftentimes just require a communication among stakeholders that are regionally specific. I thank you again for your time and happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Webster, I do appreciate you coming.
Yeah.
Couple of questions that that's kind of run across my mind and speaking with others on the committee. What kind of environmental studies do y'all do, regarding wildlife or just the overall environment, where you're deciding to put a project?
Sure. States could require specific requirements. The different states could have different requirements. So I'll speak in generalities, going back to those wind energy guidelines. Typically a year, 2 years of pre-construction studies are done for the sake of principally birds, but also bats. Habitat assessments, both within the project area and the surrounding area, to understand sort of how wildlife might move both within and around a project area. We do a number of population-based studies if the situation warrants it, such as an endangered species is in the area or critical habitat has been designated. And then those studies are typically submitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service and ideally the State Wildlife Agency. And as we progress from one tier of the WEGs to the next, we actually kind of take a feedback loop from the agencies to continue to tailor these studies all the way through post-construction, which typically is done fatality monitoring for 2 years after construction. Circumstances could dictate more.
Well, and do y'all have any policies when y'all, I guess these leases are new to us, but typically what, 25, 30-year leases? Do y'all have any kind of policies to decommission the windmills? Or y'all just gonna walk away, leave them sitting out in the field where they're not working anymore? I mean, is there any kind of procedures in place?
Well, typically you have decommissioning requirements and bonds that are put up, oftentimes in the form of some sort of surety. However, the notion of sort of decommissioning these facilities doesn't happen very often. 25, 30-year leases were sort of the norm 15 years ago. They're kind of crawling up to more like 40-year leases now. These are very valuable assets. They are a power plant at the end of the day. So even when you reach kind of the end of the shelf life, so to speak, of the technology, you will very often find that the project is repowered, and that's happening in sort of the early stage development areas of the United States today.
All right, I appreciate it. Anyone else have any questions? Chairman Carter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On these windmills, whenever I guess you would consider the footers, whenever you're digging down into the earth to place the bases of these things, typically how far down do you have to go to install one of these windmills?
Foundations you're asking about.
Right.
It depends on soil conditions. I would say if we were to call generalities, 12-foot deep, 30-foot diameter. I was out at the crossover project, and that looks like about what they're doing there, but obviously I couldn't see under the ground, but diameter wise, it looked to be about that size.
So 50 feet is not, you wouldn't have to go 50 feet to put one of these things.
That would be an unusual circumstance, but certainly not unheard of.
Okay.
Yeah. We're looking for solid ground to kind of base on. So we bore down typically 50 feet for each turbine location, sort of understand the matrix of the soil content and composition. Then based on bedrock or whatever that solid surface is we're looking for, that dictates the depth.
Well, the reason why I asked that is because, I mean, the Delta is majority wetlands. So you would have to go deeper just because of the soil composition. So that's the reason for my question is well, how deep are we going? And the reason I asked that is we talked about ag land and pesticides and fertilizers being sprayed. I worry about what happens to the groundwater underneath. Are we going deep enough where we could potentially penetrate aquifers? Those are concerns that I have.
Yeah, it's a fair concern. I don't think it's possible. One, I think an aquifer, by and large, considering the tonnage of a wind turbine, would probably represent an unstable area to build in. Do keep in mind, though, that geology is such that you can move 100 feet in any one direction, perhaps, and find a completely different substrate to work in. You know, to use a layperson's example, you know, the aquifer ends and you have more bedrock available. But the notion of, I think, groundwater contamination as a result of wind turbine construction is not realistic. I will also add, you mentioned the wetlands. Obviously, turbines want to go in higher elevation areas, but because of the predominance of the low-lying area, rice farms and whatnot, we actually do elevate the foundations as well. So there's like a artificial gradient, if you will, that's added, usually about a foot or two.
All right, Senator England.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Webster, I have a question that you may better be able to answer by just getting information back to us as opposed to now. But when you were reading your statement, I guess about middle way through, you mentioned that there's a measurable relation between windmills and wildlife, here particularly waterfowls.
Yeah.
I would imagine. And then you said that the impact, that you view the impact as being low because otherwise national policy towards these windmills would be different. Did I understand you correctly on that? And because to me, that's not data that's going to help me make my decision whether national policy doesn't care about, you know, the waterfowl in Mississippi, maybe, as much as it cares about wind power. So if you could expound on that, maybe.
Yeah, I did not make myself clear. I mentioned a national dialogue, not necessarily a policy. So whether that's a regional, state-specific, a county, or a U.S. based, my assertion is over the last 20 years, with large majority of these 75,000 turbines operating for decades now in areas like the Prairie Pothole region that was mentioned earlier, if there was actually a measurable impact that was of a population level concern for hunters, conservationists, we would be having a much different conversation here, but we are not. Like, the thing that's most interesting about this situation is the studies that have been done were done sort of in the earlier stages of wind development in the United States, late 2000s, early 2010s. And then the issue just sort of went away. And so for a large majority of us that have been around a long time, when waterfowl kind of came up as a concern, it was sort of like, oh, that's a new one or a revisited one. So that's what I meant by national dialogue. I apologize for the confusion.
Okay, thank you. The reason I ask, obviously, is duck hunting is very important here in Mississippi to a lot of people, and it always has been. And I know that there have been issues specifically in Mississippi with the number of birds that we're seeing down here. And so even a measurable effect could be something that we want to look at more heavily than what national policy and national dialogue may want to look at. But thank you, Mr. Webster. I appreciate it.
Yeah, for what it's worth, the conversation yesterday with the agencies, you know, we're talking about, you know, using our project in part to do some kind of a regional study with agency partners, including Mississippi. So, thank you.
Anyone else have a question? All right, thank you.
I appreciate your time. Thank you.
I don't think we're gonna be able to get to everybody, but we're gonna try to get at least a couple more presenters. Is Mr. Rourke Peterson here? Come on down.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Chairman Carter, Chairman Suber, distinguished members of the committees, really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm from Kansas, and so it's nice to be someplace that's a little warmer this morning. So thank you all for that. My name is Rorik Peterson, and I serve as the Senior Director of Project Development at Steelhead Americas, the North American development arm of Vestas, the world's leading wind turbine manufacturer and service provider. Vestas employs more than 5,200 people across the US and Canada, with 45,000 megawatts of installed turbines and over 40,000 megawatts under service. In 2024 alone, Vestas spent $1.7 billion across the US supply chain, working with more than 1,000 suppliers. In my role, I lead a team of project developers developing wind farms nationwide with a pipeline of over 5 gigawatts. I've spent nearly 17 years developing wind projects across the country, but I'm especially proud to be here today because Steelhead developed Mississippi's first wind project, the Delta Wind Project. This project is already delivering economic benefits to the Tunica County community. And I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Wes Riles, a landowner in our project and a partner during the development of the project who worked with us on Delta. He should probably be up here speaking instead of me, but he can certainly describe his experiences with the wind project as a landowner and a resident within the community. He has also seen firsthand the opportunities that wind energy can bring. Wind energy represents a major economic opportunity for Mississippi. The commissioning of Delta Wind in 2024 was an exciting milestone, laying the foundation for future wind development in the state. These projects create jobs, attract investment, and generate new revenue streams that benefit local economies. Across the US, the wind industry supports more than 300,000 jobs, many in rural communities. In Mississippi, wind energy provides employment in construction, operations, and maintenance, while also offering landowners, ag producers, and rural counties diversified revenue sources. Lease payments and property tax contributions from wind projects help stabilize incomes for farmers and fund local schools, infrastructure, and public services. Looking ahead, energy demand is expected to rise 15 to 20% over the next decade, driven by new data centers, AI, and domestic manufacturing. The Southeast, including Mississippi, is seeing rapid growth in these sectors. Many companies behind new data centers, such as Google, Amazon, and Meta, have set ambitious carbon-free energy goals. Meeting this demand, strengthening grid resilience, and ensuring Mississippi remains competitive for major economic investments will require a diverse energy mix that includes wind power. As a fuel-free resource, wind energy provides predictable, reliable electricity and helps protect ratepayers from fluctuating fuel costs. During Delta's development, Steelhead took great care to ensure that the project met the highest environmental and operational standards. In total, we conducted 2 years of avian and eagle use surveys, 2 years of raptor nest surveys, 1 year of bat acoustical activity surveys, a full season of bat summer presence and absence surveys, a wetland and cultural resource surveys, and a phase 1 environmental site assessment. These studies informed project siting, risk assessments, and operational protocols. We worked closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks before and after conducting these studies, and neither agency identified significant wildlife concerns. Additionally, a bird and bat conservation strategy was developed in collaboration with these agencies to ensure best management practices. In addition, during the development of the project, we went through a rigorous process with the Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Defense regarding the siting of the turbines with respect to impacts to air navigation. During that process, both agencies and departments informed on considerations with respect to the siting of the turbines, and at the conclusion of the process, issued determinations of no hazard for all turbines within the project. The project also received a certificate of public convenience and necessity from the Mississippi Public Service Commission. Now, I know the chairman mentioned some potential legislation referencing a moratorium, and respectfully, we ask that the legislature do not consider any moratorium for wind energy development in the state. If enacted, a moratorium could stall projects already in development, delaying the delivery of affordable homegrown wind energy to Mississippi's businesses and residents. So thank you for your time and consideration, and I look forward to answering your questions.
All right, does anyone have any questions? So on these surveys that you said, y'all prepared 2 years or started working 2 years out. What was the results of your surveys? What kind of steps were you taking, or what did you figure out based on the migratory birds, the bats, other wildlife in the area?
Sure, absolutely. So it's the conclusion of those surveys, there were no sort of abnormal or undue impacts expected. And those were shared with the Fish and Wildlife Service as well as the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries and Parks. They provided their consultation and feedback, and that informed the development of that bird and bat conservation strategy, which it basically employs best practices and informs post-construction and operational standards for the operation of the project. Now, Steelhead's business model is to develop projects and then partner with a long-term sponsor that will then own and operate the project long-term, which has happened with the Delta project. And so the owner operator would need to speak to current and ongoing operational protocols, but our standard development process, like many developers in the industry, includes those studies and the information formed into that operational strategy.
All right, thank you. Senator Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Just a question. You mentioned a moment ago about the economic impact. Do you have a number as far as the Delta project or what the economic impact on Mississippi it might be on, tax proceeds, landowners and all that?
Unfortunately, I don't. Typically, these wind projects contribute both in terms of landowner payments and contributions to the local tax base. Those are often tens of millions of dollars in both accounts over the life of the project. And so it's a significant benefit for landowners, for the local tax base, which of course feeds into local services provided by the counties and the communities.
Understood. I think I know the answer to this, but going forward, any idea of what the economic impact could be on potential future projects?
Well, it would be similarly significant, both in terms of jobs, not only during construction, but long-term. These are long-term, high-paying jobs to residents local to the community. And then again, it's just significant payments to landowners to enable landowners and ag producers to keep land within their families and to benefit local schools. Certainly, the wind industry in Mississippi is pretty junior compared to other states, but coming from a state like Kansas, where I've seen rural communities benefit through new schools and maintaining the presence of those schools, where the wind farm in the county represents over half of the tax base in the county, it's a very significant benefit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you give me a number of what these windmills are generating as far as power goes?
Sure. So there's a rated nameplate capacity of each turbine. They have increased with time over the years. I'd say on average, you're looking typically at 4 to 5 megawatts for a typical wind turbine on average. And then, of course, the actual energy generated by each turbine will be subject to the wind resource and the net capacity factor of that turbine. In reality, though, it is several 100,000 megawatt hours per year of generation. We think on average, typically a wind farm of the size of Delta, for example, would generate enough electricity to power roughly 60,000 homes.
But do we have a number? I mean, it was stated that this has been in operation for 4 years. Do we have a number of what has been generated over the last 4 years or on an annual basis?
So to correct myself if I misspoke, the Delta Wind Project went in operation last year in 2024. I'm sure we could get a number in terms of how much energy has been generated so far. There would be some reporting with respect to the total output of the wind farm. I don't have it available, but I'm sure that information could probably be ascertained and provided.
Next question is we had a presidential election and we have a new administration, and he has emphasized energy as his new initiative as far as turning the economy around. Do y'all anticipate friendly or unfriendly policy coming from the federal government, and how will that affect your future planning?
No, I appreciate the question. I think ideally we would hope for friendly policy. I think the energy forward policies from the administration are the right approach. And those have typically included an all of the above energy strategy, including wind. And many states have benefited from that approach for the better part of the last 2 decades. And so we would hope at the end of the day that the administration sees the benefit wind and other energy sources would bring to the overall energy mix, domestic energy supply that can contribute to our resilience. And we're hopeful that at the end of the day, as we move forward, we'll come to that common ground.
I kind of want to go back to about your survey. my understanding, you did work with the Department of Wildlife Fisheries regarding the bats. Did you discuss any other wildlife, like migratory birds or anything like that?
From my understanding, yes, those were key parts of our studies. There were 2 years of avian use surveys and eagle surveys that include evaluations of waterfowl and migratory birds. And so I would expect that those would be key considerations as part of those discussions as well.
You heard earlier, Ducks Unlimited, Mr. Penny spoke and referenced that a 75% decline in some of the redhead duck habitat. What would your response to that be?
My response is I'm not informed on the details of that project, admittedly. I would say to some degree, there are probably some unique characteristics with respect to coastal wind that may not be applicable everywhere, but I'm not the subject matter expert. I would kind of reiterate some of Stu's comments regarding the presence of wind development in similar habitats for the better part of the last 20 years, including in the prairie pothole region. I think of southern Minnesota, where there is significant waterfowl presence and also significant operational wind energy. To Stu's point, this is something we certainly discussed as an industry, but has, to my knowledge, largely resulted in few notable concerns or impacts. So I think we as an industry, and certainly at Steelhead, are eager to contribute to additional discussion and study to consider impacts unique to the Delta region. But I think evidence and history elsewhere suggests that there is not significant reason for concern.
Does the windmills, do they change maybe the flyways? They change maybe the route that the birds are traveling? Do y'all have any knowledge on that?
I don't personally. I think there's probably a litany of peer-reviewed research that would provide information on that. I think there's been consideration of impacts to migratory pathways, to ground-based bird species. Certainly, there's plenty of research that would provide some detail on that. I can't personally speak as a subject matter expert to that, but certainly some of that information could be provided.
I appreciate it. Any further questions? Senator Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On y'all's project, as far as dealing with the wind energy, is this a 100% totally private funded project, or are you receiving federal grant or federal assistance on it?
Sure. So the project itself was developed effectively privately through Steelhead as a developer and private landowners. And the owner operator is currently just what is known as an independent power producer, not a utility. Effectively privately funded. Like every energy project, there is some form of federal primarily support through incentives or tax credits, which is certainly the case for this project through tax credits that have been afforded to energy projects for quite some time.
Do you know a percentage of what's being subsidized?
I do not off the top of my head for that project.
So you wouldn't know if with the new president and his policies, if this was to change, would it affect whether y'all would go further through with your project?
Well, for the project in operation, obviously, any policies that were in place when the project was built and financed would remain for the 10-year period of those tax credits. For future development, certainly we would look at policy with respect to tax policy, other federal policy, certainly state policy with respect to the development and the economics of any project. But I would reiterate that effectively every form of electricity generation has enjoyed some form of federal tax support during its existence. And so, frankly, our reality is not unique to that.
All right. Well, I sure appreciate you coming to Mississippi and appreciate your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
How about Mr. Glenn Holloway? We got 5-7 minutes or so. I'm gonna try to get down the list best I could, but
I'll try to talk fast. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee. We've heard a lot of things this morning about from the wind turbine guys. We've talked about ducks. We've talked about wildlife. I would like to talk about the people. In Bolivar County, which is where our efforts began, We're a very populated rural community, and farming is our number one income. Now, these wind turbines are placed in odd configurations, which makes it difficult. I'm a member of the Mississippi Agricultural Aviation Association. I'm also represented in the national side. I've been doing this for 40 years. So over the course of the 40 years, we've got GPS computers in our airplanes, which allows us to make the most precise, accurate application of crop protection products that help the farmers grow the maximum amount of crops with the least amount of inputs. And these situations with these wind turbines in the area of farming are going to make it extremely difficult. We're going to have to offset. We're going to have to go around them, and it's a specific application is going to be extremely difficult to make. We also have a very shallow water table. Our aquifer, I've got farmland. Our aquifer, we hit water about 40 feet. So my question is, if it goes down below 40 feet, what's the cement going to do to the water table? How is it going to disrupt the aquifer and the water table? What's that going to do to irrigation on my farm? We also have the issue of cleanup. As a member of the National Association and a representative, I've got friends all over the country. We've got a friend in Iowa that lightning hit one of the wind towers and exploded it. And this person was sent a bill for over $1 million because they had to clean up not only their land, but the two neighbors where it scattered out across, because the EPA deems this stuff as hazardous waste. So it has to be disposed of according to EPA standards. We have almost 4.2 million acres of farmland in Mississippi, and that generates over $100 billion in income to the state of Mississippi, and that's taxable income. So what we would like to see, honestly, is a environmental impact study that takes all of these things into consideration, because, I just say that God's not making any new land, and once it's gone, it's gone. So that's what I'm here to bring before you today. Yield to questions.
How difficult is it to spray? Does it affect the chemicals once you release them from the airplane? How does that affect if you're around a field that has some of the wind turbines?
We don't really know. I know that I've got a real close friend in Iowa, and I know the one thing that they're battling right now is cross-pollination of seed corn. In Bolivar County, we grow a little over 38,000 acres of rice. A big portion of that is seed rice. So if you take the airplane out of it and you have this cross-pollination of seed rice, that's going to cause a lot of problems with people that grow rice for seed.
Stated that you had your GPS in your airplanes, and if you're having to change your route, is this additional cost to farmers? Is there more cost involved for you?
Yes, sir.
I'm sure you're gonna pass along, but
Yeah, if there's a wind turbine within a mile of the field, if we have to turn around it or if we have to work around it, that adds time. The only two constants in the aerial application industry is insurance and note payment. Everything else is based on your per hour, how long it takes you to do something. Your fuel, your maintenance, your pilot's pay, everything is affected by your cost per hour. So if we have to work around those and it adds to my cost to make that application, then I've got to pass it to someone else, whether it be the grower or the landowner or the next person down the line.
appreciate it. Does anyone have any questions? I think we have time for maybe one or two. All right. Well, I sure appreciate you taking your time to come down here and speak with us today.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. Got a motion? All right, so moved. Let's go. Thank you.